welcome everyone to tonight's Art Unlocked talk, in which we're bringing to you Glasgow Life Museum's art collection on display in Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. I'm Jo Meacock, I'm the Curator of British Art at Glasgow Museums, and I'm presenting tonight alongside my colleague Pippa Stephenson-Sit, who is the Curator of European Art. And we're so delighted that Art UK and Bloomberg Philanthropies have asked us to present to you tonight. So Kelvingrove, well, Kelvingrove is Scotland's most visited museum. We have over 1 million visitors every year. The building opened in 1901 at Glasgow's second international exhibition. The first one in 1888 was to raise funds for this building, and there was a competition in 1892 won by the London firm of Simpson and Allen. Now this was a bit controversial because a local company, Honeyman and Keppie, who Charles Rennie Mackintosh worked for, also put in a design, but they didn't win. But nobody was disappointed when they actually saw this amazing kind of Spanish Baroque building. It's so theatrical and flamboyant, and there's sculptural details throughout commissioned from George Frampton, who of course was a pioneering new sculpture artist. Most notably, there's a bronze sculpture of St Mungo at the main entrance, the Parkside entrance. Now, I need to say this right from the outset, that the building was not built back to front, and the architects didn't jump to their death. It was always meant to face the Parkside and the university. It was actually one of the first buildings in Glasgow, public buildings, to have electric lighting. And we have these amazing Art Nouveau pendant lights in the main hall and in the east and west courts. We also have an organ. It's the only art gallery that I know of that has an organ, a Lewis & Co organ that was installed in 1902, and it's still played every day at 1 o'clock to the delight of our visitors. They love it, and it just resonates throughout the whole building. It's wonderful. We have 22 galleries in Kelvingrove displaying 8,000 objects. And we have one of the finest art collections in Europe. It's particularly strong in French and Dutch and Scottish art, and you're going to see some examples of these in tonight's presentation. The museum is family friendly, and it promotes an inclusive, accessible and anti-racist agenda. And we're also leading on a Legacies of Slavery and Empire project within the wider museum service. I'm going to hand over to Pippa, who's going to start sharing with you the artworks that we've chosen tonight. We've chosen 6 artworks, and we're going to take you through those. So enjoy tonight's talk. Pippa.
Thank you, Jo. It's me. Yes, my name's Pippa Stephenson-Sit, and I'm the Curator of European Art for Glasgow Museums. That's quite a wide remit that covers art from about 1460 through to 1960, that kind of era. And it's my great privilege to have in the collection some really incredible Dutch and Flemish paintings, which are mostly on display in our Dutch and Flemish gallery, and that's on the first floor. And one such work is this incredible picture by Rachelle Ruysch from about 1683. Now, Ruysch is one of the most successful and best documented female painters of the Dutch Golden Age. And in fact, if you ask most people to kind of come up with historical female artists, Ruysch tends to be one of the top on the list. Now, that's just due to the kind of lower availability or options that females had at the time if they wanted to become artists. There were fairly few and far between. Now, Ruysch was only 19 when she painted this work. And this is the beginning of a very long and illustrious career as a specialist painter of fruit and flower still lives. She enjoyed a very successful career, became court painter to the Elector Palatine Johann Wilhelm. She was praised by her contemporaries, and with numerous poets, in fact, devoting verse to her, and she had her portrait painted several times. Now, flowers and fruit still lifes, a very respectable genre, and she was great at what she did. However, this was seen as a suitable artist for a suitable subject for female artists. They were banned from studying the figure in life drawing classes. So in fact, she was, she would be very much encouraged into this specific genre. In fact, it was one of the few that she would have been kind of permitted to do. And what you have here is a series of flowers and insects, and in fact you might see a little lizard if you look closely, and butterflies populating this scene at the forest floor. There's a couple of details here. So for example, the green leaves, and you might notice that some flowers appear pale blue, and that's in fact because the paint pigments have changed over time, so they would have been a slightly different colour when she painted it. But back to Ruysch. So from the age of 15, Ruysch trained in the workshop of the experienced and successful painter Willem van Elst, and she stayed his pupil until he died in 1683. So she had a very illustrious start, trained, very much as a still life painter. But in this painting, rather than showing the influence of Van Elst, who painted rather grand scenes, still lifes, she actually showed a debt to the artist Otto Martius van Schriek, who was a friend of Van Elst. Van Elst was obsessed with plants and reptiles. He actually kept numerous live and stuffed examples in his studio. And he is credited with inventing the surprisingly popular forest floor genre. These are paintings showing imaginary scenes of flora and fauna inhabited by small creatures in a woodland setting, and that is exactly what you are looking at here, but of course carried out by the young Rachelle Ruysch. Now, like Van Schriek, Ruysch was inspired and influenced by plants and reptiles. This shouldn't come as a surprise when you know her background, because her father was the eminent Professor Frederick Ruysch. He was an internationally famous botanist and an anatomist at Amsterdam University, and he built up a large collection of animal and plant specimens. And it's very likely that Ruysch featured some of these examples in her paintings, and we know that she certainly studied them. Now, her interest in the natural world is clear and evident from the careful attention to detail that she pays to each of the flowers or small creatures within this composition. The insects that you see include 6 species of butterfly, including the red admiral and the female emperor moth. The flowers upon which they rest include red poppies, carnations, and dandelions. But like many of the forest floor paintings, Ruysch's scenes possess an unnatural and contrived feel. She painted with lifelike detail, but some of these plants are of the wrong proportions, and the detail of a lizard eating a butterfly, which you may be able to see just in the bottom right-hand side, adds a somewhat kind of surreal, unnatural effect to the painting. This painting could be regarded in symbolic terms. Those of you familiar with Dutch and Flemish art of the 17th century will know that symbolism was a very big part of the genre. And so what we might see, for example, in the fleeting nature of flowers with their temporary bloom and the fragile creatures, they could equal the transience of life, or perhaps the burst of bright life amongst the dead, dull landscape could represent the hope of spirituality. But it's also possible that this painting had a purely decorative purpose, as was, again, the trend towards the end of the 1600s. Ruysch was an incredible woman. She was known for her elegant still lifes, and that she painted in later years. She was married to a portraitist, Jurian Poel, of whom we don't know a great deal. We know a lot about her. She had 10 children, and she continued to paint well into her 80s, until after the age of 84. 10 children, and over 100 paintings of her survive today. Now, very excitingly, from November next year, this painting will be included in the world's first major monographic exhibition on Ruysch. So yes, that's the first major exhibition that the world's ever had on Ruysch. Quite astounding. And that exhibition will start at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich before travelling to Toledo and Boston in the USA. And this is one of 2 works that we are lending. We're very pleased to lend to the exhibition. Lending our works, of course, allows scholars to see them, place them in a wider context. It adds to the academic knowledge about an artist. and it is very important for those reasons, amongst others. Now, this painting came into our collection from the vast collection of the Glasgow coach builder, councillor and magistrate Archibald McLellan. It's one of about 300 paintings and sculptures that we acquired from his collection when he died in 1854. He did want to give his collection to Glasgow Museums, or to the city rather, but he accumulated a lot of debt, so we had to purchase them for about £40,000 at the time. Now, McLellan's collection had a strength, as we can see, in Dutch and Flemish, but also in Italian art, and that's where our Titian, Christ and the Woman Taken in Adultery, came from. And the importance and the breadth of that collection, in fact, formed the foundation of Glasgow Museum's collection. So we do have the obsessive collecting of Archibald McLellan to thank for some of the really wonderful examples that we see in the collection. I'm going to pass back to Jo.
Oh no, I think you've got one more.
Nope. Now I'm going to continue straight on. So let's. Right, from one bright, beautiful painting to another one. So this painting is made by Frank Auerbach. It's called Mornington Crescent, Winter Morning, 1989. And it's a painting of Auerbach's local scene, local area. This is painted just around the corner from the studio where he's worked for over 50, 60 years. And we acquired this work along with its sister painting, or another painting by Auerbach, in 2015. Now, these all came from the collection of Lucien Freud, the British painter. When he died, he left 46 paintings by Auerbach, of whom he was a great fan, obviously, to the nation, but he left them in lieu of tax. And this is a really wonderful way that museums can acquire objects. Instead of paying tax upon death, artists or the estate of artists can leave collections of paintings which can be gifted to museums. And Freud said that he wanted to leave these works, but he insisted that they were dispersed across the country. So museums were invited to have a look at the long list of 46 works, which were grouped, sometimes in pairs, as this was, sometimes in clusters, and to apply for which works they thought would match their collection, and, you know, to explain why they thought they should have these works. And we were thrilled to receive our first request. And this is one of those works. It's very big. I haven't got the dimensions there, but it is really quite large. Now, Auerbach, Frank Auerbach, he's 92 years old today, not today, but this at the moment, and he is considered one of the greatest living British artists. Now, he's a nationalised German artist, so he was sent to London from Berlin at the tender age of 8 by his parents, who were very sadly murdered in one of Hitler's death camps. Now, Auerbach trained at the Royal College of Art in London, and it's there that he studied with the painter David Bomberg, what was then known as the Borough Polytechnic in London. And it's there and then that Auerbach started to develop this very distinctive style where he layered paint upon paint, and it took on quite sculptural qualities. And you can see that in the other example that we have in our collection, Head of EOW, where the paint is so thick that sometimes it would the picture would fall off the wall because it was just too heavy to hang. So yes, Auerbach's individual way of working involved creating many paintings on the same board or canvas before he arrives at a composition that he's happy with. As I mentioned, in the early days, he would pile paint upon paint, and he would create this very, very thick, gloopy paint layer. But somewhere in the 1970s, he kind of changed his technique, and instead he built up layers. But then he would build up a layer, scrape it away, and start again, and that would leave kind of a ghost of what came before. And he said, although I use much less paint now than when I couldn't really afford to, 95% of it still ends up in the bin. I think I'm trying to find a new way to express something. So I rehearse all the other ways until I surprise myself with something I haven't previously considered. So this artist is rehearsing. He's trying things again and again. Every day he tries something new until he comes upon something that he's happy with. So yes, in the 1980s, his landscape changed, and instead of being cramped and chaotic, they become brighter. His brushwork becomes looser, as you can see in this And you can see the deep strokes of the painting. His description of space becomes a lot more literal, allow us to place individual landmarks. So, for example, in this, you might be able to see the lamppost jutting out from the center of the composition. Chimney stacks as well, you might be able to see those, and that curve of the crescent going back around in the crescent at the back of the picture. Now, when we acquired this work in 2015, I wrote to Frank Auerbach, one of the most famous painters alive today, just because that's one of the benefits of having a live artist, which you don't often get in my line of work. But you can write to them and ask them why they made the work, and he wrote back incredibly. So we have a small extract of that exact letter with his wonderful handwriting on the wall next to this picture, and in the letter he very kindly explained the painting, and he said that the title, which is Winter Morning, it refers to when the painting was finished. So he talks about hundreds of sketches that he made on the spot, and then he would start every day anew until one day he came upon the composition, and winter refers to when he finished the picture. So this painting is the result of much toil, many months of work, until he came upon this. He suddenly decided that this was the composition he wanted. We display this work downstairs in Kelvingrove. For those of you who've been before, you might know that we have what we call the Looking at Art Gallery, which is just off the central expression court. And in that gallery, we show all kinds of art alongside all kinds of other art. So you might have a 17th century Dutch portrait next to a 20th century modern British picture. And what we're trying to do with this is we're telling conservation stories, but we're encouraging new perspectives. So we're inviting our audiences, our visitors, to think about art in new ways. And this very large picture is hung behind glass, but at a height that people can get up quite close to it and really have a look at the incredible sculptural properties of it, and the color and the form and the energy. And often you'll see school groups, in fact, stood in front of this picture, and our wonderful learning and access curators use this one regularly to talk about modern art and to talk about the landscapes around you, and how the children might want to how they might form their own landscapes. And they found that people respond very well to this picture. So now it is, I believe, over to you, Jo.
Thank you. So something quite different again. John Duncan Ferguson on the beach at Tangier. If we can move on. Thank you. Wonderful. So Edinburgh-born Scottish colorist painter John Duncan Ferguson is perhaps best known for his bold, decorative paintings of statuesque, sensual women inspired by the light and heat of the south of France. That and his Scottishness, he retained a strong sense of Scottishness throughout his career. So you're probably wondering, why am I showing you this work? Well, this is a really rare early work that dates from 1899, when he made a trip to Morocco. Now, obviously, Morocco is very much in the headlines at the moment because of the devastating earthquake around Marrakesh. The area that Ferguson visited was further north of that, in Tangier, which is at the Strait of Gibraltar. And he was inspired to go there by the example of fellow Scot and Glasgow boy associate Arthur Melville. Melville had been in North Africa and the Middle East in the early 1880s. And according to Ferguson's partner, the dancer and choreographer, Margaret Morris, I quote here, Ferguson decided to go and see for himself the effects of intense light and shadow. And I think you can see that in this painting with its bright light and its strong shadow. And like Melville, he was drawn to the deep azure blue of the sea, which is a compositional linchpin for this particular painting. It's also reminiscent of some of the paintings of Joseph Crawhall, another Glasgow boy artist who visited Tangier in the 1880s. And it's similar in terms of its bold colour and sense of design. Unlike other European artists in Africa at the time, Ferguson arguably didn't exoticize or other the fishermen here. The figures and boats on the shore and in the water give a sense of daily activity in this busy North African port city. But Ferguson was one of many privileged European artists in Morocco at a time when Europe was shamelessly colonising Africa. Diplomatically, Tangier was a hotspot in 1899, with Britain, France, and Germany all having interests in the area. But Ferguson was primarily interested in composition and form. And here, clothing and vessels, they provide colour accents in a pictorial arrangement. Now, the Scottish colourists were a group of 4 artists, Ferguson, Samuel Peploe, Francis Cadell and Leslie Hunter. They were quite different in terms of the kind of work they produced, but they shared some things in common. They were all notable for their bright use of colour, their expressive handling of paint, and also their interest in design, form, and decorative effect, influenced by French post-impressionist art and also Fauvist art. They didn't actually exhibit together until 1924 when the Glasgow art dealer Alexander Reid arranged an exhibition in Paris, and the term Scottish colourist for the group wasn't actually coined until all but Ferguson were dead. So this was in 1950. Now, Ferguson was a bit of a leader by nature. He was exuberant, he was intellectual and very sociable. He was largely self-taught. He studied for a time at the Académie Julian and the Académie Colarossi in Paris, and he stayed in France longer than any of the other Scottish colourists. He spent a long time in Paris absorbing kind of cafe culture and the art and literature of the day. He met some of the most avant-garde painters of the time, people like Picasso and Matisse and Derain, which had a huge influence on him. But he was really drawn to the heat, as you can see in this painting, and he moved to the south of France in 1913. He had to come back in the outbreak of World War I in 1914, but he was back in the south of France in the late 1920s, and he stayed there until the outbreak of World War II. Now, we have an amazing collection of Scottish colourist works on display in Kelvingrove, and many of them were acquired through then director Dr. Tom Honeyman, who was a former GP turned art dealer before he became the director. And so he knew the Scottish colourists personally, developed relationships with them, and so it was through him that many of the and through his negotiations that many of the artworks came into our collection. Ferguson may have been born in Edinburgh, but there's lots of Glasgow connections, not least the Glasgow Boy connection, which I mentioned before, but also Ferguson's first major solo show was in Glasgow in 1923 at Alexander Reid's gallery. And at the outbreak of World War II, Ferguson and his wife, Margaret Morris, moved to Glasgow. They moved to Clouston Street in the city's West End near the Botanic Gardens, and there they stayed for the rest of their lives. And they had an immense impact on a new generation of emerging artists in Glasgow. Ferguson founded the New Art Club in 1940, and then the new Scottish group in 1942. So I think it's really interesting when looking at this painting, when Ferguson's only 25, and he's an emerging artist at the outset of his career, and he's starting to think about what things are important to him in terms of colour and form, and he's looking to an older generation of artists for inspiration. And in fact, he declared of Arthur Melville, "Although I never met him, his paintings gave me my first start. His work opened up to me the road to freedom, not merely in the use of paint, but freedom of outlook." Now to something quite different. This year marks the bicentenary of the death of Scottish painter Henry Raeburn. He was a Royal Academician, he was a member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and also a member of the Academy in Florence and also the newly created Academy in New York. He was knighted in 1822 and he was appointed portrait painter to George IV in Scotland. He was the son of a weaver and a mill owner, but he was orphaned at the age of 8. He initially was apprenticed to an Edinburgh goldsmith, James Gilliland, and then became a miniature painter. And it really, I guess his career as a portrait painter kicked off in 1880 when he had the fortune to marry a rich widow, and which enabled him to paint. And in 1784, he visited the studio of Sir Joshua Reynolds in London, which was a very formative visit. He was very influenced by Reynolds' grand manner of portraiture. And then, armed with letters from Reynolds, letters of introduction, he went to Rome, and he was in Rome until 1787 when he returned to Edinburgh. And then he spent the rest of his career in Edinburgh building up a very fashionable portrait practice. And he basically painted the Edinburgh elite of his day. So he was painting judges and lawyers and politicians and physicians and aristocrats and landowners and writers and thinkers and intellectuals. These are the kind of people that he was painting. And he was really prolific. He painted over 1,000 portraits in his day. And his portraits are known for their directness and their expressiveness. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't tend to make preparatory studies, but painted directly on the canvas. And so there's an immediacy about his portraits. And he didn't only try to capture a likeness, but also something of character, because he was very influenced by Enlightenment ideas about perception and human nature and empirical study. He was familiar with philosophers such as David Hume, Thomas Reid, and Archibald McLellan. The portrait painter Thomas Lawrence declared that Mr. Raeburn's style is freedom itself. Now, this is quite ironic because research has uncovered a darker side. There are many links between Raeburn's artistic practice, his business interests, his sitters, and the transatlantic trade in enslaved people. Here we can see Robert Nutter Campbell and his wife Margaret Campbell. Robert is wearing breeches and he's carrying a crop, so he's obviously been out riding or he's going out riding. Margaret has a gold chain around her neck and her hair is curled and pinned up in a fashionable style, and they are walking arm in arm through their estate of Cailzie, which is in Peeblesshire to the south of Edinburgh. They purchased the estate in 1794 and built a brand new mansion there, along with lodges, coach houses, stables, granaries, a brew house, kennels, a walled garden, greenhouses, etc. It was an ostentatious display of wealth. But where did this money come from? So Robert's father owned a plantation in the Caribbean, which Robert inherited. He also had his own plantation, Carrière, on the east coast of Grenada. And 232 enslaved men, women, and children laboured there. So that is the dark side of this painting. And Raeburn himself, in fact, he had his own shipping business, which was based in Leith, Henry Raeburn and Co. And this company exported goods and luxury products to the Caribbean and imported cotton and other raw materials from the Caribbean. So he was very much also tied up with the transatlantic trade in enslaved people. His firm became bankrupt in 1807, the very year that the trade in enslaved people was abolished in the British colonies. He went bankrupt largely due to the Napoleonic Wars, but I do wonder whether it also had something to do with abolition. So collaborating with Changemakers, which is a collective of South Asian young people and part of our shared cultural heritage project within the museum, we have been creating interventions within our galleries to tell these really important stories, these hidden stories that we really need to tell. Also, the Changemakers, who are a fantastic group, have been creating a museum test for curators so that going forward as we develop displays, we can think more closely about about empire and colonialisation, and about enslavement and representation. So some of the questions asked on this museum test are things like, does the display incorporate the voices and experiences of people of colour? Does the display use language which celebrates the British Empire or those who benefited from it? Does the display contain objects which were looted or acquired through violence? So a very important test, I think, for us all as we're moving forward. But to move on to war, I'd like to show you now Nora Nielsen Gray's A Belgian Refugee. Nora Nielsen Gray was a painter and a fashion plate designer, one of a group of female artists who trained at Glasgow School of Art, that became known as the Glasgow Girls, following the adoption of the term Glasgow Boys to describe their male counterparts. After graduating from Glasgow School of Art, she joined the staff there and she taught fashion design and drawing. And she had her first single artist show at Warnock's Gallery in Glasgow in 1910. And she became particularly well known for her portraits, her intimate portraits of women and children. These were decorative, but they also were typified by a kind of tender restraint or sadness. She wrote in a letter to the Glasgow designer E.A. Taylor in 1912 that she was desperately interested in people's faces. The Belgian Refugee, which you can see here, was begun in 1915, and it was exhibited at the Royal Glasgow Institute of the Fine Arts in 1916, and it's one of her most moving paintings. The muted colour scheme and empty background speak powerfully of numbness and loss. The slumped pose, sorrowful eyes and empty hands remind us of the human tragedy of war. The painting's intimate, it's dignified, and it's full of tragedy. Now, neutral Belgium was invaded by Germany on the 4th of August 1914, which brought Britain into the war because Germany had violated the Treaty of London, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. And the invasion by Germany became known as the Rape of Belgium because of the atrocities that the Germans carried out. Massacres, executions, hostage takings, burnings of towns and villages. And 6,000 Belgians were killed. 25,000 homes and other buildings were destroyed, and 1.5 million people fled the country. That's 20% of the population. And about the same again were displaced. And over 20,000 sought refuge in Britain. Now, Glasgow has a history of welcoming refugees. In 1999, it became Scotland's first asylum dispersal city. And in 1914, it welcomed 8,000 Belgian refugees. And in fact, the Mitchell Library in Glasgow has a database containing the names, ages, occupations, gender and addresses of all the Belgian refugees who came to Glasgow then. It also has the Lord Provost's letter books, which document how the city and communities sought to get behind the refugees and carried out fundraising and supported the refugees that came to the city. Now, Nora Nielsen Gray, she wasn't an official war artist, and in fact very few women were given contracts as war artists. She actually served as a voluntary aid detachment nurse with the British Expeditionary Force in France at the Scottish Women's Hospital, which was part of the French Red Cross Hospital at the medieval Abbey de Roymont. And she worked nights and then painted during the day. She was one determined woman. She painted doctors and nurses and wounded soldiers. And the Imperial War Museum were interested in acquiring her work for the nation for their women's work section. But defiantly, Gray refused to let them have a piece because she felt that that was marginalising her work. And she wanted her work to be considered on an equal level with the men. So she didn't sell her work. Scottish Country Life wrote in March 1921, Miss Gray is to be honoured because she has fought her own art battles and achieved by virtue of her own compelling ability. She died from cancer 10 years later, in 1931, aged only 49. And the year before, the Glasgow News wrote, "It is sometimes remarked that women painters do not attain the same strength and sureness of power which characterises men. It may be suggested also that after centuries of men painters and men critics of painting, it is not surprising that the man's point of view is dominant. Whatever may have been the prejudice against women painters, Miss Nielsen Gray has been able to overcome it, for her works are in galleries in Paris, Brussels, Nice and Toronto, as well as those of Great Britain and Ireland." Now, today is an ongoing project within Glasgow Museums to counter the historic gender imbalance within our collection and also within our displays. And so excitingly, we are hoping to redisplay the Glasgow Boys Gallery in the near future, bringing in the girls, about time too, I hear you say, and also other avant-garde artists who were working in Scotland at the time. So watch this space. Over to you, Pippa.
Thanks, Jo. So I'm going to finish up the objects tonight by focusing on a sculpture in the collection, and this is work by Auguste Rodin, called Fallen Angel, and we do have a number of Rodins in the Burrell collection, which, as you may know, the Burrell collection recently reopened last year in the south of the city, and we've just been awarded Art Fund Museum of the Year. So you can see, I think, almost all of our sculptures, our 14 works by Rodin, are there on public display at the moment. So do check those out. But this sculpture is tucked away just at the top of the stairs in Kelvingrove near our French gallery. It's an intriguing work, and hopefully you can see here, but you've got two figures twisted together forming one mass. A female figure has fallen on her outstretched wings. She lies sprawled on her back against a rocky base, and her body forms a curl with her arms flung above her head and her face hidden. There is a second figure. She crouches and tenderly embraces the first, one arm protectively over the other's chest and the other comforting or supporting her from underneath. Now, this sculpture is part of Rodin's assemblage technique. Rodin built up a huge collection of plaster casts, which he created over many years. And these casts included individual figures in many positions, as well as individual heads, limbs, and other body parts. And they formed a kind of repository or a library for the artist. He could use these individual elements to develop this assemblage technique, where he would combine them in different ways, creating new sculptures using old parts. Wonderful descriptions exist, writings of the artist, how he would turn these objects over in his hands and piece them together. Now, both figures in Fallen Angel can be seen in a number of other designs by Rodin. So the sprawled angel was based on a single sensuous form entitled Torso of Adele. This fragmented torso featured on the artist's Gates of Hell, which was a monumental door for a decorative arts museum that never came to be. Nonetheless, that was a project which spawned many individual projects for Rodin, such as The Thinker, for example, and Eve. And the Italian Adele Abruzzi was one of Rodin's favourite models, and she posed for the artist a number of times, first in the 1880s. Rodin used the figure of Adele to form the female half of his famous sculpture Eternal Springtime, and that's a sculpture made during his torrent affair with the sculptor Camille Claudel, and that really encapsulates their passion. Now, the crouching figure you see here is based on Fallen Carroted with Stone, which is a sculpture that also occupied a position on the Gates of Hell. The subject of the work could be relating to literature, and the pairing has been known as La Chute d'Ange, the Fall of Angel, linked to an 1832 poem by Alphonse Lamartine, also a work called Eloa by Vigny, and La Fond de Satan by Victor Hugo. It's also sometimes linked to the Greek myth recounted in Ovid's Metamorphosis, The Fall of Icarus, where the captive Icarus flew too close to the sun, his wings melting and sending him plummeting to Earth. Of course, in that story, Icarus was male, but Rodin sculpted something called Illusion, sister of Icarus, which shows quite clearly a female with wings descending to the ground. Now, Rodin was very fond of symbolism in his works, and this crouching woman could represent kind of the earthly realm, and the angel representing the spiritual. Their meeting symbolizes kind of a meeting of heaven and earth, or perhaps the angel's descent represents doom's illusions which end up falling and inevitably dying. But it could also represent the fall of rebellious angels led by Lucifer, the motif from Christian religion, which was sometimes depicted throughout art history. But in this image, the angels actually look decidedly heavenly. She certainly doesn't look devilish. She's got this cascading hair around her and she's incredibly beautiful. Rodin depicted embracing women in a few sculptures, including one called Damned Women, also destined for that gates of hell, which showed two women embracing in quite an explicit way. Now, using titles such as Damned Women or Fall of Angels was a convenient foil for artists to show female subjects, perhaps lesbian subjects, which when it was considered very socially unacceptable and sinful to show two women embracing in such a way. So artists would have to come up with an excuse, which could be, the title of a book or something like that. But Rodin depicted female love in a number of his drawings as well, which came later. And he was, evidently quite interested in the interplay of female bodies. Now, this is quite an underrepresented topic, something that certainly requires further research to look at his representations of lesbianism and of female love. And it's one that, would be very interesting to look at further. Now, for this sculpture, people often ask me when thinking about Rodin, is that the original? As you may know, Rodin cast a number of bronzes. He would very rarely cast just one. It was much more made much more sense for him to use the expense of the bronze casting process to produce a number of them. He produced a number of states, in fact, of fallen angels, so with slight differences. And for this second state, as seen here, he adjusted the position of the crouching woman's arm. Instead of remaining hidden, as in the first version, it reaches over the other figure. So he was making very definite decisions to have this arm reaching over the chest of the other woman. And there can be 8 casts identified as belonging to this state. So this is one of 8, including this. And it was probably cast in 1903, so while the artist was still alive. But others can be found in collections across the world, including the V&A in London, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Sumaya Museum in Mexico. And this sculpture was given to Glasgow Museums by the estate of Leonard Gow, who was a Glaswegian ship owner, businessman, and great collector of art. Very similar to what William Burrell was doing at the time, and he was a kind of a rival contemporary collector at the time. And apparently Gow bought this one from a dealer in Paris in 1922. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to pass you back to Jo to conclude our talk.
All I can say is thanks again to everyone for attending tonight's talk, and I hope we'll see you in Kelvingrove very soon. Thank you.